Alright, so today we're going to talk about what is blood, just a bit of a revision. What does it do? Why do we need artificial blood? Types of artificial blood? And the future of blood. Who can tell me what's in blood?
Plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and other nutrients. You've got hemoglobin.
Very good. So that's great. So pretty much exactly what you said. So there are a whole lot of different components of blood. You went into lots of detail there, but in general, it's a fluid that has cells in it. Okay, so it's not just a liquid, it has cells in it. It's got three main cellular components, which you said before, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And it's also got a fluid component in it called plasma. There's about 5 to 6 litres of blood in your body, and when you give a blood donation, does anyone know how much blood you give during a donation? A litre? Not quite a litre? Yeah, half a litre. Yeah, exactly. Because if you take much more than that, you start to feel a little bit crook afterwards. Okay. And blood is mostly produced by your bone marrow, but it can also be produced by other organs in the body as well, including your kidneys. So we've got an image up on the screen here. You can see a blood vessel up in the top left-hand corner that's been cut, and there's a whole lot of stuff spewing out of the blood vessel. So that's blood. And there are a whole lot of different arrows to each part in the blood. So, can you see the little arrows that are labelled number 1 on this diagram? Do you have any idea what those big red disc things are inside the blood?
Are they red blood cells?
They are. They're red blood cells. Very good. I'd like someone in the class to tell me what they think the arrow that's labelled number 2 is pointing to.
Is it a white blood cell?
Yep, that's exactly right. It's a white blood cell. Very good. And you can tell it's a white blood cell because it's got a nucleus in it. And generally when you stain these cells under a microscope with a particular stain, the nucleus comes up purple. Who can tell me what the arrows for number 3 are? Platelets. Very good. What's number 4? Plasma. Very good. Alright, so that's a bit of a revision for you just about the components of the blood, and that's important because we need to understand how all those components work to understand what we need in artificial blood. Alright, so there are a couple of different functions that blood has. Can someone tell me a couple of different functions of the blood?
Transport nutrients and take out nitrogenous wastes.
Uh-huh. What else does it transport? Oxygen. So it's important for oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. What else does it do?
It clots wounds.
Yep, it definitely does. So it's important for clotting. How about that one, the second little icon down?
It has immunoglobulin and fights against infection and external bacteria.
Very good. So it's very important in the immune response because it carries all of those white blood cells that are important in the immune response. So the blood is important for oxygen and carbon dioxide transport, the immune response, for clotting because you've got platelets in it, and for transport of metabolic products. So that can include sugars, can include proteins, and it can also include nitrogenous wastes that need to come out of the body via the kidneys. Why do you think, if our blood does such a good job of doing all these things around the body, why do you think we need artificial blood?
Like blood replacement and if people are sick for it?
Yeah. Yep, so I think you said it's important for blood replacement if people are sick, and that's very true. But we have blood donations to do that. Why can't we just keep using blood donations? What's the problem with donated blood?
Because there isn't enough.
Yeah, there's a limited supply of it. Yep, very good. So that's the first one. There's a limited supply. There are a couple of other different things. What do you think, Williama?
compatibility?
Yep, you've got to cross match it and make sure it's the right type because we've got different blood types. Very good. There are two other ones.
The shelf life?
Very good. So it doesn't last very long. And there's one other one. There's a risk that comes with using actual donated blood. Yes, very good. Well done, guys. So you've covered all of them. So the reasons why we need artificial blood include a low supply, because not enough people donate, and they're not necessarily donating the type of blood that we need. There's also the problem with blood typing, so if someone receives a donation of blood, it needs to be the right type of blood, otherwise they have quite a catastrophic immune response. There's also the risk of disease. Now this isn't so much of a problem as it used to be, but there are still some diseases in blood that aren't routinely screened for, and so there's still a risk that receiving donated blood, in some countries more than others, that you might contract a disease. And then we've also got shelf life. So donated blood, because it's a biological product, because it has proteins in it, it's only got a limited shelf life. Okay, so getting on to artificial blood, the potential artificial blood is quite, it promises lots of things, and it promises to overcome lots of those limitations of real blood. So it has the potential, if we make it right, to have a really long shelf life and be able to be stored outside of the fridge if we make it correctly. If we can sort out cost issues, we might be able to make it very cheaply, a lot cheaper than going out and receiving blood donations and storing them. It might also be able to be mass produced, which would be a big advantage. And we could also, if we make it correctly, get around the problems with blood type matching. So we could make it a universal blood type. So you wouldn't have those problems with rejection. So that would be great. We could also make it sterile. So if it was something that we were synthesizing, then we could make sure it didn't have any diseases, because it wouldn't be coming from an actual human. So this isn't actual artificial blood, this is the potential of artificial blood. So at the moment they're doing lots of research about different artificial blood, and the ultimate, if we could make the perfect type of artificial blood, it would have all of these characteristics that I just talked about. So at the moment there are two main types of artificial blood that they're doing research on, and they're at different stages of the research and clinical trial process. We've got one here which is Haemoglobin-based. So hemoglobin, as you know, is the pigment inside red blood cells, makes them red, and it also carries oxygen. So what you can see here in this picture is what that protein looks like. The protein is actually made up of 4 smaller polypeptide chains. In each little polypeptide chain there is an iron heme group, and that binds to oxygen and carries around the blood. Now the other type is perfluorocarbons. Now this is a synthetic type of artificial blood, and the reason why I've put this picture in is it shows a beaker filled with a liquid, and you've got a little mouse in the liquid, and I can guarantee you that mouse is alive. On top of the liquid there's some water and some fish in the water. So it's showing you two properties that I'm going to talk to you about. First thing is that liquid that the mouse is in is perfluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons can hold a lot of oxygen, and when you breathe it in, because it holds so much oxygen, it's not like being in water. You don't drown when you breathe it in because it holds so much oxygen. So that mouse is quite happily sitting under that perfluorocarbons, even though it's in liquid. The other thing is that perfluorocarbons don't mix very well with water. So it's the same situation when you put oil and water together, they don't mix. So if you put water in with perfluorocarbons, they separate out, and they've just put some fish in the water at the top just to make it look pretty, I guess, and to prove a point. So I will talk about those two different types of artificial blood. And just to give you an idea as well, shows you just how big the particles in real blood versus artificial blood is. So I've got a red blood cell there. It's 7 microns wide, a normal red blood cell. Down the bottom there, we've got a haemoglobin-based oxygen carrier. So these are types of artificial blood just based on haemoglobin, and they're very, very small compared to red blood cells. They're less than 0.1 of a micron wide. Perfluorocarbons are a little bit bigger. They're about 0.2 microns wide. So just keep that in mind, because we will go back to that and talk about how that affects how the artificial blood goes through the body. So haemoglobin-based artificial blood types, haemoglobin is normally found in red blood cells. So it's a normal protein that's normally found in the blood, so that's an advantage. However, this is one big disadvantage of haemoglobin-based artificial blood. Because you saw in that previous picture that haemoglobin-based artificial blood is so small compared to red blood cells, when that artificial blood passes through the kidneys, it actually clogs up the kidneys, and it's quite toxic, and it causes renal failure. So that's, in the past, different trials of haemoglobin-based artificial blood have been failures because they've caused renal toxicity in people and different animals. What they've done after that initial trial is they changed the formula and they stabilised the haemoglobin that they were using. They either get this haemoglobin from human cells or from cow cells, and they stabilise it by clumping different haemoglobin proteins together. So to make it a bigger protein, so to make the blood particles bigger so it doesn't clog up the kidneys, and therefore it's not as toxic. So at the moment, this is the closest method to being approved for use, and some examples include these trade names at the bottom: Hemopure, Polyheme, and Hemospan. Now, there are still some limitations of haemoglobin-based blood, so it doesn't fit all of those criteria of the perfect artificial blood that we were talking about before. It still requires refrigeration because it is a protein. Who can tell me what happens to proteins at the wrong temperature?
They become denatured.
Yeah, they become denatured, so those proteins unfold, and when the proteins unfold, then they don't do their job properly anymore. So it's very important when you're dealing with proteins to keep them at the correct temperature and the correct pH for them to work. So a haemoglobin-based artificial blood would still need to be kept in the fridge. We also have a limited manufacturing ability to produce haemoglobin-based blood, so we haven't got past that cost problem and the supply problem yet. And also, haemoglobin-based artificial blood would only carry oxygen. It wouldn't perform all of those other functions of normal blood like we talked about, so clotting, immune functions, and carrying metabolic wastes. So it's still not the perfect artificial blood, but this is the type of artificial blood that's closest to being able to be approved for use. So let's talk about perfluorocarbons. Like I said before, they can carry about 5 times more oxygen than haemoglobin, so that's really promising, and that's why that mouse was able to float inside the perfluorocarbons quite happily. But it's insoluble in blood, and it's insoluble in water like you saw, so we need to combine it with lipids to form an emulsion. Can someone tell me an example of an emulsion? An interesting emulsion might be when you do the washing up. Hopefully you guys do the washing up for your parents occasionally. So when you put detergent in with oil and the fats on the plate, then that forms an emulsion, and it allows the fat and oil to dissolve into the water, and it helps you clean the plates. So that's what an emulsion is. So it helps you combine water with hydrophobic chemicals. Perfluorocarbon is about 70 times smaller than red blood cells, like you saw in that picture before. And one advantage of this is they might be able to provide oxygen to areas where normal blood flow has been blocked. So some of the brand names of perfluorocarbon include Oxygent and Oxycyte. And this is still in trial phases in most places around the world, but for example in Mexico, this is quite a legitimate type of artificial blood that's used at the moment already. Can you tell me what part of the body this is, what we're looking at?
The brain.
The brain. And do you want to have a guess, based on the picture, what's wrong with this brain?
Some sort of cancer or it's starting to die.
Okay, so it's not a cancer, but the second part that you said, it looks like it's starting to die. What sort of disease you think this might be?
Stroke.
Yes, very good.
Stroke.
So this is a stroke, and a stroke happens when one of the little blood vessels inside your brain either becomes clogged or ruptures. And that means that blood doesn't get to a part of the brain anymore. It has no oxygen, and that part of the brain begins to die. So this is possibly a disease where perfluorocarbons might be very useful, because if we put perfluorocarbons into the blood, and normal blood can't normally get to that part of the brain to reoxygenate it because the blood supply has been cut off via the little capillaries, the perfluorocarbons might be able to soak through because they're so small and still provide oxygen to that part of the brain. So that's quite a promising use of perfluorocarbons. And just to sum up on perfluorocarbons, so they do fulfill quite a few more of our perfect ideal characteristics of artificial blood that we mentioned at the start. It has a long shelf life of approximately 12 months. Because it's not a protein, it doesn't have any antigens in it, it's universal. So it gets past all of those blood type matching problems. It's also sterile because it's synthetic and we've produced it, and it can be mass produced. However, the downside is it only stays in the body for 48 hours before it's removed. So while it's very good for some situations in donating blood, it's not very good for people who require a large amount of blood all at once. So for example, people who have been in a car accident and lost a lot of blood, perfluorocarbons wouldn't be a good thing for them to receive, at least not just a single donation, because after 48 hours that perfluorocarbon is lost and they haven't had enough time to produce enough of their blood to replace what they've lost. So that's one disadvantage. So the future of artificial blood. This is a little ball of cells. This is called a zygote. So you can see there, if you count the cells, there are 8 cells, and this is the start of a human. And what you can see there is a little tube, a little needle that's gone into that ball of cells and is taking out one of them. So this is a stem cell. Particularly, it's called an embryonic stem cell. What do you think is special about a stem cell compared to a normal cell?
They can become any type of cell, like they can specialise to become anything.
Yeah, so they're not differentiated yet. You're exactly right. So they have the potential to become anything, and they're of very high research interest, because what they've done now is they're now able to culture cells, and if we can culture stem cells, we can add different little signals and different chemicals to them so that they can turn into different cells that we want. Stem cells might also be very useful for making artificial blood. And in this case, we're not talking about stem cells from an embryo, because there are ethical problems with that. The sort of stem cell research they're talking about for making blood, they're talking about growing red blood cells from stem cells from either bone marrow or umbilical cords. So when you have, if you ever have a baby, they'll often ask what you want to do with the umbilical cord blood, because it has a lot of stem cells in it, and if you donate that blood and those stem cells to research, then they can do cool things like this. The red blood cells that they've so far made from these stem cells have a similar oxygen carrying ability and lifespan as red blood cells that are normally found in the body, so that's promising. And they also select these cells to produce O-negative blood. So O-negative blood is the universal donor. So it's pretty much like a universal blood type. However, making red blood cells from stem cells is still a really complicated and expensive process, and it's still being researched. So that's of the 3 different types of artificial blood, this is definitely the furthest away from being a reality, but they're still researching it. So in summary, guys, this is what we've talked about today. We've talked about what blood is and what does it do. That's real blood. And then we've talked about why we need artificial blood, because that's really important if you ever need to do this in an exam, to justify why artificial blood deserves to be researched. We've talked about 2 types of artificial blood, haemoglobin-based blood and perfluorocarbons, and we've talked about the future of blood, artificial blood, in the form of red blood cells that might be produced by stem cells.